Sheffield, 1947, and Harold Birch, 68 years old, a widower, a pension of 26 shillings a week, lifts a cast-iron pot from the coal range with both hands, the way a man lifts something he has lifted 10,000 times before, something he trusts completely because it has never once failed him. One pot, one flame, one meal that will last 3 days. There is no refrigerator in that kitchen. There is no supermarket within reasonable walking distance. There is a rationing book on the shelf beside the salt, 2 ounces of butter allocated for the entire week, and a knowledge so deep and so practical that it never once needed a name. Today, British households throw away an estimated £730 worth of food every single year. Food purchased, forgotten, and discarded without a second thought. The solution to that waste was not invented recently by a nutritionist or a lifestyle journalist. It was perfected quietly over decades of absolute necessity in kitchens like Harold Birch's across the north of England, the industrial Midlands, the Scottish coalfields, and the Lancashire mill towns. And then, within a single generation within living memory, it was erased so completely that most people today do not even know what was lost. 16 meals, each one forgotten, each one costing under £2 in today's money. Each one designed for a man living alone, cooking on one ring, eating from one bowl, washing one pot. Number 16 is where the countdown begins, and it begins with oats and water and a low flame. Number 16, oatmeal broth. A pot of cold salted water on the range, 1 onion quartered, 1 carrot broken by hand into rough pieces, and a generous fistful of large oat flakes folded in and left to swell over the lowest heat for 40 minutes. It cost a matter of pence in 1947. Scientists would confirm decades later that oat beta-glucan actively reduces cholesterol and supports cardiovascular function in older adults. Harold Birch did not know that. He knew it kept him warm through February and filled him until morning. Number 15, scrag end stew. The scrag end of mutton was the cheapest cut the butcher could offer, the neck, the bone, the connective tissue nobody else wanted. In Yorkshire in the late 1940s, an elderly widower who knew his butcher would collect this for a few pence, add a turnip, add barley, and leave the pot to simmer for 3 hours on the lowest heat the range could hold. What emerged was dense with collagen released slowly from the bone over those long, patient hours, the same compound that expensive supplement manufacturers now sell at considerable cost in capsule form. The collagen from those bones was doing something no vitamin pill could replicate. Number 14, pea and ham knuckle soup. Dried split peas sold across Lancashire in the early 1950s at roughly 2p per pound. 1 smoked ham knuckle, a cut the butcher practically gave away, went into the pot cold alongside soaked peas and a single bay leaf. Hours of slow simmering followed, the kitchen filling with a smell that was dense and savoury and deeply reassuring. The pot yielded 3 or 4 full portions, 1 ham knuckle, 4 meals, the arithmetic of survival dressed quietly as supper. Number 13, potted dripping broth. In the West Riding of Yorkshire in the early 1950s, a retired coal mine worker living alone would keep his Sunday joints dripping in a small clay pot on the cold larder shelf, sealed beneath a thin layer of salt to hold it through the week. By Wednesday, that stored dripping had become the base of a broth. Root vegetables, water from the tap, a low flame, 1 pot, 1 hour. Household management manuals of the period described dripping reuse as a cornerstone of sound, economical domestic management. The fat that modern nutritional orthodoxy would later condemn was the same fat keeping these men functional on 30 shillings a week. Number 12, bubble and squeak hash. 2-day-old boiled potato and cold leftover cabbage pressed into a single cast-iron pan with a small knob of lard and a ladleful of stock, cooked over high heat until the base formed a dark, solid crust and the edges browned. 8 minutes, 1 pan, 1 plate. The BBC Home Service had broadcast versions of this method to millions of British households, and widower pensioners had been practicing variants since before the war ended. It was not a recipe. It was a philosophy of nothing wasted. The Ministry of Food, in a wartime pamphlet circulated to households across Britain in the 1940s, laid the principle out without sentiment. Cook simply, waste nothing, extract everything the pot can offer. It was not advice, it was arithmetic. The coal range burned whether you used it or not, so the flame had to earn its cost every time it was lit. Women's Institute instructors in Yorkshire taught these methods to widowers and retired working men cooking entirely alone for the first time in their lives. men who had previously eaten whatever a wife placed before them and who now faced the range with no map and no instruction. What those instructors understood was that these were not recipes in the modern decorative sense. They were systems, closed loops. The dripping from one Sunday joint became the base of Wednesday's broth. The water in which vegetables had been boiled became tomorrow's stock. The stale bread at the week's end became the body of a soup that cost almost nothing. Nothing left the kitchen as waste. Everything re-entered the cycle. The central irony, and it is the central irony of everything that follows, is this. The habits that scarcity built with such precision were abandoned the very moment scarcity eased. The moment convenience arrived on the British High Street, the knowledge was set down quietly, and it was never picked back up. Number 11, lentil and bacon pot. A factory retiree in the Midlands in the mid-1950s knew red lentils as the cheapest pulse available, sold loose by the pound, expanding dramatically in boiling water, needing nothing more than time and a watchful eye. 2 rashers of streaky bacon rendered first in the pot, then lentils and 1 diced potato added for 40 minutes of steady heat, dense with protein, iron and fibre. Everything a man needed, from a pot costing less than a bus fare across town. Number 10, vegetable hot pot. In Lancashire and Yorkshire, single retired men who kept allotments. And the allotment movement was substantial, with tens of thousands of plots in active use through the 1950s, rarely needed to buy vegetables at all during the growing months. Swede, carrot, leek and potato came from 30 square yards of carefully tended soil into 1 pot with water and a stock cube. Allotment Society records describe members routinely producing weeks of single-person cooking at effectively zero cost beyond the original plot fee. Every ingredient came from the soil. The pot did the rest. Number 9, tripe and onion boil. Dressed tripe sold in dedicated shops across Manchester and the north at a price within reach of any pensioner on any income. Into 1 pot, the honeycomb tripe already cleaned and prepared by the tripe dresser, covered in full cream milk, surrounded by thickly sliced white onions, left to simmer for 90 minutes until it softened into something yielding and unexpectedly tender. Ministry of Food nutritional guidance identified offal specifically as among the most nutrient-dense and affordable foods available to the single-person household. Tripe shops served thousands of older customers weekly through the 1940s and 1950s. By 1980, they had nearly vanished from British high streets entirely. That disappearance was not accidental. Number 8, kippers with potato, along coastal communities of the north, Hull, Grimsby, Hartlepool. The smoked kipper had been a staple of the single working man's kitchen for generations. The smoking preserved the fish naturally for weeks without any refrigeration. A retired dock worker would poach the kipper in a shallow pan of water, 1 potato resting beside it in the same liquid, the deep smoke flavor transferring into the cooking water and absorbed steadily by the potato as both cooked together. 1 shallow pan, rich in omega-3 fatty acids, under 4p a portion. The smoking had preserved it for weeks. The poaching unlocked everything that remained. Then something entered the frame, and it arrived wearing the face of progress. Canned soups appeared on British grocery shelves in growing volume through the late 1950s, and manufacturers positioned the arrival as liberation. No pot, no simmering, no understanding required of how heat and bone and pulse and water interact over time to produce something genuinely nourishing. A food historian examining that period would note that the sodium content of a single commercial can far exceeded anything a home-simmered broth would carry, and that the cost per unit of actual nutrition was higher, not lower, than the 1-pot tradition being displaced. But it required no knowledge, no patience, no understanding of what a coal range could achieve over 3 hours on a quiet weekday afternoon. Convenience won. What it displaced, it did not preserve. From the early 1960s onward, supermarket chains expanded aggressively across Britain, displacing the corner butcher, the fishmonger, the tripe shop, and the loose pulse counter in succession. Simultaneously, domestic science, the school subject that had transmitted 1-pot cookery, pulse management, fat reuse, and broth making to every generation of British children, was reduced or removed from secondary school curricula, a process that accelerated sharply in the early 1970s. Dorothy Hartley had documented the full breadth of British domestic cooking traditions with extraordinary care. But documentation is not transmission. The knowledge was written down. It was not taught. Number 7, bread and dripping soup, stale bread, never discarded in any British working-class household of the 1940s, torn into rough pieces and dissolved into hot salted water, enriched with a spoonful of beef dripping and one onion sweated until soft in the same pot. A Ministry of Food pamphlet on bread reuse described this as one of the simplest means of converting domestic waste into genuine sustenance. It sounds like poverty. It kept men warm through winters that killed. Number 6, porridge with treacle in Scotland and across the northern coalfields from the 1930s through the 1960s. Rolled oats in salted water finished with 1 tablespoon of black treacle was a full meal. Morning or evening, 12 minutes, 1 pot, under 3p a portion. Women's Institute circulars from Scottish branches described oat cookery as a foundation of single-person domestic economy rather than a health choice. Black treacle, nutritionists would later establish, is among the richest dietary sources of iron in the traditional British kitchen. The men cooking it in the 1940s did not know that. They just knew it worked. Number 5, potato soup with parsley. In Liverpool and Manchester, Irish immigrant workers brought a tradition of potato cookery requiring 4 ingredients, 1 pot, and 25 minutes of unattended heat. Potatoes peeled and diced small, 1 onion, cold salted water to cover, dried parsley stirred through after rough mashing directly in the pot with the back of a spoon, under 4p. Silky, filling, warm throughout. A meal that had crossed the Irish Sea and lost nothing in translation. Number 4, savoury pearl barley pudding. In rural Yorkshire, retired agricultural labourers knew pearl barley as a grain of extraordinary patience, absorbing twice its volume in stock, producing something closer to a thick, savoury pudding than a recognisable soup. A marrow bone in cold water with barley and 1 roughly chopped carrot, 2 full hours in 1 pot, yielded a dense, high-fibre meal that kept for 2 days without refrigeration. Pearl barley cost 3p per pound in the 1940s and stretched reliably across a working week. Modern supermarkets stocked it, quietly removed it from shelves, then just as quietly brought it back without explanation. Number 3, budget cockaliki. In Scotland in the 1940s and 1950s, retired fishermen and farm workers cooking alone knew to ask the butcher not for a whole chicken but for the carcass, the back, the wing tips, the parts costing almost nothing because nobody else had thought to ask for them, into 1 pot, carcass in cold water, 2 or 3 leeks sliced thick, a handful of pearl barley. 2 or 3 patient hours over a low flame. Women's Rural Institutes of Scotland circulars described this as producing 4 substantial portions at a cost representing genuine and dignified thrift. A carcass the butcher would otherwise discard entirely. A pot that fed 1 man across 4 consecutive days. The arithmetic of dignity, requiring nothing more than time and the willingness to ask for what others had overlooked. Number 2, OXO and noodle broth. By the late 1950s, the OXO cube had become the single bridge between the old tradition of long simmered bone broth and the accelerating world of convenience. A widower pensioner in urban England dissolved 1 cube in boiling water, added a handful of fine vermicelli, added 1 carrot sliced as thin as the knife allowed, and had a hot meal in 15 minutes for under 6p, not as nutritionally complete as a 3-hour bone broth. Higher in sodium than any traditional stock, but fast, familiar, and preserving inside its small compressed cube the ghost of the broth tradition that the supermarket had not quite managed to kill entirely. It survived the erasure, barely, by making itself convenient enough to be kept. Number 1, Scotch broth. This is the origin. Every other meal in this countdown is a descendant. Neck of mutton or lamb placed cold in 1 large pot with dried split peas, pearl barley, 1 carrot, 1 piece of swede, and a leek covered in cold water, brought slowly to a simmer over the lowest possible heat for 3 full hours without rushing, without lifting the lid, without interfering with what the heat and the bone and the thyme were quietly doing together. Scottish domestic science textbooks from the early 1940s described Scotch broth as a complete meal in a single vessel requiring no additional course. The Ministry of Food, in wartime guidance archived but not widely republished, commended it as among the most nutritionally complete and economically efficient meals available to the British household. In 1950, the ingredients cost less than 1 shilling. Today, the same pot costs under £2 and yields 4 or 5 generous portions for a man eating alone. The NHS, examining models for affordable nutritional support for elderly people living independently, has returned to precisely this category of meal, not because it is fashionable, but because the mathematics of nutrition and cost have not changed in 80 years. Every other meal in this countdown descended from this pot. The knowledge to make it was passed hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, generation to generation, until one generation set it down and walked toward the supermarket shelf instead. And now Harold Birch's cast iron pot sits on a cold and silent range in a Sheffield kitchen sometime in the mid-1970s, clean and dry, perfectly still, unused. On the windowsill beside the net curtain, a single unopened can of condensed soup. The pot holds its silence. The knowledge sits inside it still, perfectly preserved, perfectly forgotten. Try one this week: the Scotch broth, the lentil and bacon pot, the pea and ham knuckle. Set it in the morning. Walk away. Come back when it is ready. Your grandfather did not think of this as cooking. He thought of it as knowing. Now you know it too.